Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, we are so many. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to SIS Seminar 2. We are in Palermo, in SIS Salon, which is actually the place where we should have begun our seminars, unfortunately, with the COVID. We couldn't do it physically, but we still decided to do it online to keep our program and to go forward in our programs no matter what. So actually today it happens to be the day of the National Day commemorating the liberation from fascism. Actually, it was a happy coincidence that we decided to do this seminar today, especially because of the current situation we are all going on, and also the discussions around authoritarianism and the rise of new forms of authority in this context globally. I think we will speak mainly about the situation in Europe. We hope that your loved ones are safe and sound, that you are safe and sound. I just would like to say some words about SIS Seminar, which is entitled Politics of Emancipation, because it is the theme, the general theme of our first residency program, which had to take place from April to July 2020. It is an online free program, so many people now are entering, and I'm very happy about it. They're entering from all over the world. Because in terms of limitations of freedom of movement, this system seems to us able to connect different locations and different discourses. It seems to give us the possibility of making maybe an atlas, if not a diagnosis of the current situation from different points of view and from different locations. And also it is a transdisciplinary program. The aim is not to remain in an academic discourse, but the aim is to cross and to interlace different approaches. In this moment, people are connecting from the United States, from France, from Zimbabwe, from Brazil, from Switzerland, from Turkey, from Germany, from Austria, and other places. The first SIS residency fellowship entitled Politics of Emancipation was attributed to Nkosilathi Emmanuel Moyo. He's a human rights defender, a writer, a poet, and a political activist based in the small mining town of Kwekwe in the Republic of Zimbabwe. He is a co-founder and director of a community-based organization named the Zimbabwe Organization for Youth in Politics, a grassroots non-profit youth organization advocating for youth participation, representation in political processes, policy formulation, and citizenship rights. His life has been threatened several times by suspected state agents in Zimbabwe, subjected to death threats, torture, arbitrary arrests, raids, and continued state surveillance for his resistance. So thank you. It's a real honor to have you with us now. So please, Nkosi, I give you the word.
I was straight to the first point to say Africa is totally inadequate to deal with the preparedness of this virus. Most African countries, I said it earlier on that, yes, my presentation will not represent all 55 African countries, and I'd already said 54 if you ask Morocco, but that's a debate for another day. But our random sampling showed that most of African countries, to start with, are not prepared to deal with COVID-19. People are surviving through their religious beliefs to say God will protect us, this will protect us, this will run. And I want to believe in to actually understand their belief in doing so, because I'll start with Zimbabwe as a case study to say Zimbabwe is totally not prepared to deal with COVID-19. I'll use the case of one very promising, very prominent young man called Zororo Makamba, may his soul rest in peace, who succumbed to this virus. It took the case of Zororo Makamba to show Africa, to show the entire world that Zimbabwe is totally not prepared to deal with this virus or to fight this virus. Zororo Makamba returned from Zimbabwe, reportedly from New York, and they were, I'm told he had some signs or symptoms of having contracted COVID-19. And Zororo was taken to Wilkins Hospital. Wilkins Hospital is like the main center to deal with COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. And there was no ventilator, totally no ventilator. He was failing to breathe and there was no ventilator. And like they're from a very rich family, and their family had to buy the ventilator, bring it to the hospital, and only for the hospital to say, okay, fine, you have bought the ventilator, but we don't have the plugs and whatever you can use to connect the ventilator. And Zororo had to lose his life. I'm talking about the preparedness of our country to say we are not fully prepared, we are not properly prepared to deal with this pandemic. I will go straight to the issue of social distancing. We are dealing with a country which queues for everything. You queue for mealie meal, you queue for bread, you queue for this, you queue all basic necessities, you queue for them, and you realize that everything has to be a queue, and people have to be like banded together to get the basic necessities. So the issue of social distancing is not even practical, neither is it even feasible to maintain in the African continent. Not only Zimbabwe, I've been following the news. I've been following what is happening in other African countries, in Angola, in Luanda. People can't survive without queuing. In South Africa, people can, almost in Africa. Because of poor social safety networks, people can't survive without queuing. So that brings to question the issue of the practicality and the feasibility of the issue of social distancing. My second point is the issue of propaganda and misinformation. Most of African regimes are using this crisis or this pandemic to kind of misinform, mislead, or perpetuate or spread the issue of propaganda, which they use to settle their own political scores in their own countries. What do I mean? I will start by using Uganda as my first case study. We have President Yoweri Museveni, who is using all sorts of propaganda, the same way Bolsonaro of Brazil is using propaganda to say, COVID-19 is this and that, the small flu is this and that. Museveni is actually using that to consolidate his authoritarian power. I think they have elections sometime next year, and he's using this period to mislead the nation, to allocate unjustified budgets to his cronies, to parties, to affiliates, some organizations affiliated to his party, which are perpetuating his own political and partisan interests to serve his partisan interests. So there's a lot of propaganda and misinformation in Zimbabwe. I watch our national. We are independent. We got our independence in 1980. So for the past 4 decades, we only have one television, one national television, and this one national television is state controlled, and this state state-controlled television is being used to propagate misinformation, to mislead the nation, to spread propaganda as far as the issue of COVID-19 is concerned. So most of our people are not informed, are not properly well informed about what this pandemic is, what this virus is. Both governments are using it to serve their own interests, to hide their own unpreparedness, to use it to serve their political, agendas.
It's really interesting to have a point of view from Africa, and as he rightly said, Africa is a continent, so it's quite different for us in Italy than it is in Hungary, where the prime minister now can rule by decree, or in other countries, like where invasive surveillance systems, like in South Korea and Singapore, are really, we can say, totalitarian, and at the same time they are the systems which enable the people to some sort of maintain health. But still, or in Israel, where the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has authorized his country's internal security agency to track citizens using a secret trove of cell phone data developed for counterterrorism. In Italy, we are about to enter the phase 2 from May the 4th, where we are encouraged to download an app, and this app can track all the encounters we make. And so, it's quite a question. Or the Philippine Congress also passed a legislation last week that gave the President Rodrigo Duterte emergency powers and 5.4 billion to deal with the pandemic. But lawmakers watered down an earlier draft law that would have allowed the president to take over private businesses. Everything is coming so fast. The parliaments don't even have the time to read the law proposals because they are being executed very, very rapidly. In the United States, maybe Joan, you can tell us more later, the Justice Department asked Congress for sweeping new powers, including a plan to eliminate legal protections for asylum seekers and detain people indefinitely without trial, okay? So, of course, we are witnessing sort of an authoritarian turn, but actually this authoritarian turn was already going on, we know it well. But there is something different with the emergency of the care and of the so-called feminine aptitudes and capacities of taking care of the health, of dealing with life, with all discourses of reproduction. So the role of women, and specifically of women leaders, or of leaders exhibiting feminine characteristics, is quite interesting now. And so I am wondering what kind of backlash we are going through under these new dresses of the leader. In her work, Joan, you talk about this question of the kind of the restructuration of neoliberalism under the new dresses of a sort of a feminine Louis XIV, of a feminine leader, in the absence of a leader. And you, Yves, have witnessed in global movements since 10 years about now, and in our social movements, we debate a lot about that. The fact that the crisis of the representation in some sort of way manifests the absence of the leader, the impossibility of incarnating a solid, a stable leadership, And the movements, the social movements, have interpreted and have been vocal about the fact that we don't need any leaders, but nonetheless, the problem of authority remains. So I don't know if Joan wants to say something about that.
Yeah, it seems to me one of the things now in the analyses that are being offered of what's going on, of the authoritarian rulers who are taking advantage of this situation to increase their emergency powers. I mean, in our case, in the Trump case, we have a maniac who is I mean, he really doesn't embody, he does embody, I think, for a significant part of the population, some notion of white supremacist power. But as in the Wendy Brown reading I suggested, it's a kind of completely desublimated, uninhibited, irrational expression of what the will to power might actually represent. But the thing that strikes me about the way the critique has been offered from people like us on the left is to focus all of our attention on power, on the leaders in power, on the authoritarian pronouncements that are being made, on the ways in which the state, an announcement of the state of emergency has consolidated the masculinist logic of the security state, if you want to put it in those terms. But what we've neglected is what, in my reading of Foucault and governmentality, is the place where Foucault talks about people saying, not that they don't want to be governed, but that they don't want to be governed like that. It's the refusal to accept the terms and the premises on which governments legitimate themselves. And in this moment of neoliberal capitalist politics, that is about the individual right of every citizen to do whatever he or she wants. That is about the market as the place that will save us rather than healthcare. I mean, here, the big debate that's going on now in the United States is about when to open, because as the Lieutenant Governor of Texas said, it's what are a few lives as compared to the gains of the market. So the what's interesting to me from the point of view of somebody who thinks of herself as a critic is that all of the contradictions of the neo-capitalist state in which we live right now are being exposed. No, we don't need to tell anybody that capitalism is what's at stake here, that certain kinds of authoritarian powers are being exercised. People know that, they see that every day as supplies are not being provided to hospitals and so on and so forth. What's being missed by us, and certainly by the media, are the moments of resistance and refusal that are everywhere, but nobody is paying attention to. The New York Times first page tells us about right-wing authoritarian types who are giving Trump ways of thinking about things. They talk about the organizations that are spreading Fox News and the others that are spreading these rumors about the deep state wanting to take over our individual lives. But the refusals are coming from exactly the group you're talking about, are coming from the care workers, the nurses and doctors who are saying, this is not about individual rights. This is about collective common concern. It's the thing Yves Cohen writes about in the piece that we read, the sense that there are grounds on which to refuse, and not only traditional communities, the Zapatistas in Mexico who look to older traditions of communal organization and communal lands, but the practices of these professions themselves. Teachers who care more about their students than about themselves. Nurses who care more about their patients. The other day, there was a big, there was a small protest by these right-wing groups demanding, paid for by deep-pocketed supporters of Trump, there was a protest saying, open up everything. We need the market again. Our rights as individuals are being stepped on. And they were marching down the street. I don't remember which state it was in. And a nurse in scrubs, in her uniform of a nurse, stood in front of the traffic and said, this is about the collective common good. These people were marching without masks. They were all bunched up together. And she stood there with a mask and with her nurse's uniform. And she said, this is about caring for each other. This is not about your individual rights. And there are Black groups, African-American groups all over the country who are organizing to demand attention to the fact that it's the Black lives that are dying at much greater rates all over the country than any other ethnic or demographic group. So meantime, the critics, the intellectuals are saying, look, there's inequality. The virus doesn't treat everybody equally. Well, we know that. These groups know that. And it seems to me it's time to pay attention to the places where the soft places or the fissures in the power of neoliberal politics and economics. To look for the places where people themselves are turning to each other in the jobs that they perform and saying, this isn't going to work. We can't rely on this anymore. And attention to that, it seems to me, by critical intellectuals would be a way of focusing media attention where it isn't being focused, and looking to the places where alternative views of how we might live together are actually emerging. And this crisis is forcing us to think about that in ways that we hadn't had to think about it before. So that the individualists, the libertarians who want to take off their masks and be together on the beaches are being criticized by people whom we don't necessarily think of as leftists or as critics, but who are asking how the common good is being understood, how collective action to protect one another, how the fact that my life and what I do really will have an impact on your life and what you do. That the possibility for articulating that vision of a common good, it seems to me, exists as it has not before. And how to take advantage of it seems to me to be the job for us. I wonder what Yves thinks of this, because I was really working off Yves, the article that Yves wrote. I wonder if he has something to add to.
Yes.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here and to see you and to be with you. Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you very much, Joan, for giving me the word like that. And so I'll have some hints about those common issues. And which is striking is that this very seminar is bearing witness of this those common issues we are sharing as citizens, as social researchers, so there are common pandemic problem, common solutions, probably common issues, and we know, Joan told us that it is with the same social divides. I would speak about the way epidemics is joining politics, economics, and gender relations in all areas. It is obvious that this pandemic is a dream opportunity for leaders wanting to exert their leadership, because it seems that centralization of the measures against pandemics is something which is necessary. And but we have seen that it's not the case for some of the federal countries, and the federal level can be very much more efficient than the central level. But it's not the way those big authoritarian leaders would do. And we have the example of the opposite of Germany is this way, is the example of Bolsonaro in Brazil, or of Trump. They are wanting very much centralized action. And we have the example in France where the metaphor of the war against epidemic is allowing everything, every central state measure. So we have a great number of social science issues. It's impossible to enumerate all of them. But first, of course, containment, confinement, first means control. And nowadays, control means also technology. So there are all the companies, the GAFAs, they are on their ground to develop technologies, control technologies. Overall technologies are now planned to control population at all scale, the scale of the movement, the big movements of population, but also up to the scale of our intimate life. We can be controlled in our house, in the way we are dealing with other people. Also, something striking is the tightening of national borders. And it was very, very scandalous in Europe. There is a lack of European solidarity since the very start of the pandemic. And of course, Italy can say it very well, but it's a very big problem also, this way these global pandemics is taken nationally. Also, at the scale of the confinement, the containment, it is producing the withdrawal of everyone the same way at a global scale, even if the degrees of containment and respect for its rule are very different from one country, from one continent to another. So I would like to go now to another way of reflecting about that, which is the practice, the confinement practice. Just some word, I mean, some hints. It's very, we have no time to get to detail. But I was I was very impressed by the way affective relations are intensified. And Joan was alluding to this in the profession, in the way care people, education people, but also in our private life are intensifying the affective component of relation. I think it's something very new, very unexpected, because we are thinking first about the inconvenience of being confined, but we are also inventing in the confinement, and we can see that. I won't develop it with solidarity practices with the neighborhood, with the poor people, with the homeless people, with it's very striking. Of course, there is the professional care people. They are doing that. They are in contact. Which is interesting is that all these solidarity practices are contact practices. We are obliged with the confinement to do everything at a distance. But everything which is developing some, well, collective generosity practices is by the way of contact. Of course, no, well, there is also we can make a lot of things with distance technologies, but it is interesting that also the value of contact is intensified. And we can obviously see how much women are on the forefront on this practices. It is true with the care people in the hospitals or in the urban life, but it is true also in the private space, our private space. Of course, and women are more and more important in the work at home. It's very, very visible that the burden of the work at home is more on the shoulder of the women. That it's more and more evident that confinement is exacerbating gender relations, domestic violence against women and children. It's in Brazil, I am in Brazil now, it is completely obvious. But on the contrary, we can see also the role of women in developing practice to fill the lacks of the state politics. For example, here, the favelas are completely out of the state reach, and the state makes no effort to help people of the favelas. And there are mostly women that are self-organizing to help people to live for the food, for the care, etc. This also is on the shoulder of women. So another aspect now of the situation. I see that the time is going very, very quickly. This pandemic is at a global scale, and this pandemic as a consequence of confining us in our house, in our private space, which is exactly the contrary, which is exactly the absolute antithesis of a global wave of leaderless movements in the world since during the 2010s. That's very striking. All the very important movement of this decades in Tunisia and 2010, the Arab Spring, Turkey, Ukraine, Brazil, Hong Kong, Burkina Faso, and also all over the world, and until the extraordinary boom of movements in the last quarter of 2019, just before the 2-3 months before the pandemics, all of those movements were mainly horizontal, egalitarian, leaderless, but also there were movements for getting out of home to go to the squares and there to meet people, to the square, to act with people, to live with people, to deliberate with other people, the very invention of the yellow vests in France. I'm a yellow vest. The very invention is to invent the roundabout as a democratic place, which is completely mad. Who would have thought of that before? So, and so the last decade was the decade of the inventions of those new ways of be democratic, inventing places for action, for deliberation, for everyday life, for meeting people, laboratories to build new egalitarian relationships between sexes, genders, races, religion, ages, jobs, social statuses, ideologies, beliefs, public and private skill, etc., etc. Which we could speak about that hours. So just at the moment of the very worldwide revolt against the fierce individualization wanted by neoliberalism and in the front line wanted by the GAFAM, there is this containment as a true ordeal for everybody, as a true ordeal. So it is very striking but we can link this with the question of masculinity. There was last week or 2 weeks ago a very good article in the New York Times about toxic masculinity of Trump and Bolsonaro. But the author could speak about other leaders also. And they were denounced as the leaders they were the most machos leader in the world, and they were also the leaders. They were in the denial of the pandemics. There is something like that also in other countries, like in Central Europe, in Poland. Just think in Poland, I'm thinking that in Poland, there have been very, in the middle of the confinement in Warsaw, there have been a demonstration by car, a demonstration. So our life, our ordinary life of protesting is not dead. Those authoritarian leaders. So, and what is striking is that we have a bunch of those leaders, and the point is that they are not only, but there are another things in common is that they were opposing those movements I was talking about. They were opposing this movement of trying to experiment in new ways of democracy. And there are a full bunch of ulcerated, I don't know, ulcerated leaders by the freedom the people were taking, and and they are the same ones who launched ultra-violent repressions, even in France, against the Yellow Vest, for example. The same who mounted authoritarianism and neo-fascism, as in Brazil, the same who installed dictatorships as in Turkey in Egypt, or who illegally annexed whole region and started a war like Russia. But another characteristic of those movements is the role of the women. is something which is really new, that in social movement, the women are really are on the forefront, even in the black blocs, for example. We have, so I'll accelerate, and so, but for example, in Brazil, the main popular movement against Bolsonaro as a candidate during the campaign was organized by women. The LA Now, not him. That was so. So I think that one of the characteristics of this pandemic reaction of leaders is linked to this history, is linked to this historical fact that women were coming at the forefront of the politics of social life, critics, the life culture, etc. Since maybe we can say since the moment 68. I don't speak about 68 only in France, but in the world. So a very horrible example of that, because one thing is occupying the central place, the central place of the today's crisis in Brazil power. You all know about it, and it is the murder of Marielle Franco 2 years ago, who was a woman, a black woman, deputy of Rio de Janeiro, and lesbian woman. So, and this was yesterday the center of the talk of Bolsonaro after the dismissal of a minister. And of course, the personal participation of Bolsonaro and one of his sons is completely clear. And it is, there is obviously a link between the fact that for Bolsonaro, the virus is nothing but a micro flu, and this participation to a murder. So now we have to prepare the day after, of course. The politics of preparation of social movement will be now having a new argument, which is the health, the public health, and the protection of life, and it will be something to be fight against, and we have to recover places for social egalitarian and gender movement and experimentation. I think that is our task, and I thank very much SIS for having organized this discussion.
Can I just ask a question? I think there are two contradictions. One is that the confinement is in contradiction with the sense of collective that we actually have in the face of this virus. There is something there that is it's not completely that confinement cuts us off from everybody else, but we're identifying with one another in a collective way. So there's confinement, which is isolation, versus the collective sense that is developing anyway. And the second, the more important one, I think, is that on the one hand, there are authoritarian rulers who are being able to consolidate their powers by declaring a state of emergency and extending their powers in all sorts of ways. And on the other hand, their denials of the seriousness of the epidemic And across the board, you mentioned that. That's what they've been doing. Bolsonaro says it's a hoax. Trump says it's a hoax. Their denial of that is weakening their credibility. At least that's true here. When Trump yesterday suggested that people drink bleach as a way of I mean, I think the last sense of his credibility began to crumble. Maybe his supporters, you know, his diehard supporters still think that he's right, or that he misspoke, or whatever it is he's apologizing. But when the leaders of these countries who have been systematically denying the seriousness of the virus, even as they're consolidating their emergency powers in the face of it, something about their legitimacy is also being undermined. And my question is how to use those, how to go after those two contradictions and exploit them in some political sense. What is it politically we could do? One, to increase the sense of collective even as we're confined, and two, point to the fact that the emergency powers that these guys are insisting on is contradicted by their refusal of the science and the refusal to take seriously the deaths piling up all around them. Thank you.
Can I say something? Yes, regarding this, these contradictions, I would say that these contradictions, unfortunately, they help the credibility of these leaders. Because on the one side, they are forced to recognize the actual situation, and on the other side, they can deny it, supporting the far right positions, and I mean, supporting their male positions, their capacity to make the rule. If I am drawing on Wendy Brown's essay, and in particular on the chapter 5 of her book, which you, Joan, wanted to share with us. So the contradiction in these leaders actually help them become, remain credible in some sort of way. Because from the one side, they have to acknowledge the actual situation. And from the other side, they have to acknowledge also the requests of all the right-wing population wanting to deny the crisis because of their need to go on their exploitation and organization of labor and so on and so on. So I think the contradiction is useful for them. And for instance, when you think about St. Paul, I am drawing on, for instance, St. Paul, and in particular, Paolo Napoli reading of a letter of St. Paul about charisma, about the capacity of a leader so to embrace at the same time one thing and the contrary of the same, to establish its authority. And we have witnessed it with Berlusconi and with Trump, and especially the capacity of male leaders to apply violence, because this applies to the leader. And so this legitimizes the leadership. Even the worst things, even lies, even breaks of law, even state of exception in general. So this legitimizes the authority. And I think this is quite interesting because we have the contradictions, the possibility. I am an optimist, Gramscian optimist. But I think there is the possibility that these contradictions, rather than diminishing the stability of these leaders, can be used as tools to re-establishing this kind of authority.
I really agree with the previous respondent. When we are looking at authoritarianism, I think most of the leaders, they are consolidating their power. We are seeing a reproduction of authoritarian mechanisms, especially in the African context. A good example is the lockdown that has been enforced. So what is happening is that we are now seeing the politicization of food aid, as well as the politicization of emergency resources. So you find that the provision of services to different sectors, it's now provided on political basis. So such kind of reproductions, despite exposing the poor governance mechanisms, it also gives the credibility and strengthened the power of the authoritarian leaders, because it gives them because the people right now, they don't really have the sources of their livelihoods, the sources of food, because most of the people in Africa, they live from hand to mouth. So under such a situation, any politician who gives them the food handouts, it's really a savior. Then another issue that I would like also perhaps to look at from the African perspective, it's how these lockdown measures are enforced. We are seeing an aggressive or violent military and police brutality across many African countries. For example, we have seen that in Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, South Africa, where military is really deployed to enforce this lockdown. We have seen over 450 people detained in Ivory Coast. So then the question is, why are these governments using violence in enforcing these lockdowns? So three key issues that are emerging from the African continent is that you find that violence is deployed as a substitute of the government's deficiencies in meeting fundamental human needs. So since they cannot really deliver on that, they end up intimidating the people so that the people cannot really protest. They can just stay indoors. Then we are also seeing the rules of authoritarian political games at play here. The lockdowns have really given them an opportunity to fine-tune their repressive frameworks. As well, this will help them consolidate authoritarian power, as well as to reshape their repression mechanisms. Then another outstanding element that is also coming is that these kind of mechanisms, they are coming from governments that have lost the support of the people. So they end up continuing surviving on the benevolence of security apparatus. So for them, the use of violence is really an effective tool. What is also challenging from the African perspective is that we have seen that the state's duty to protect the citizens without using violence is not really guaranteed. So they are not really assuring the rights and safety of all the people in the process, but they seem to protect the powerful, because it is the powerful politicians who have the capacity to move from one place to another, donating essential goods that are needed, such as food handouts. So which means in times of elections, these people, they have already campaigned. They are using these lockdowns as a means to buttress their political fortunes. Then one other thing that we might also perhaps try to critically look at is to start asking ourselves that with what happened with the Arab Spring that really affected much of North Africa, we are seeing the same factors that triggered the Arab Spring happening right now. Authoritarianism, food insecurity or food security crisis, political corruption, human rights violations, unemployment, inflation, as well as poverty. So with all these other factors now emerging from the impacts of COVID-19. We need to start to look at this as a potential political instability trigger. There might be a possibility of pro-democracy movements emerging post-COVID-19. So many people, they will fail to sustain their livelihoods with dignity. And these kind of public grievances will continue to pile up. And such kind of vulnerability of states might even emerge from the African continent. For example, if we look at Zimbabwe before the COVID-19, as well as countries such as in the Chad region, they had over 50% of their population impacted by hunger. So if this persists, we might see such kind of challenges emerging from the continent. That's my little contribution for now.
Thank you very much. And now we have an intervention by Aurora Fermández Polanco from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid.
Thank you very much. I'm here because I share the affection that is present in this invitation, because I have been working with Francesca and our dear friends, Silvia and Graeme. It's very important for me to support SIS, Studi Internazionale per la Sicilia, a wonderful project from the south of Europe. As Francesca said, only in the consolidation of affective links can we come out stronger from all these horrible crises. I'm joining you, although I couldn't read the articles as deeply as I would have liked to, because here and now, in this moment of urgency, I'm working with my students, I'm reading theses, and at the same time, I'm living in family with two very little children. So in a way, I'm here as the spokesperson of many women in charge of many aspects of the social and subjective life nowadays, that care of children, parents, community, and the planet has been placed at the center of our times. I understand, and in this administration of affects and care, these relationships, we can find maybe a kind of subversive potentiality to modify the structures of control. Yves say something like that, similar. I understand these links and relationships as ecofeminism considered it since the 70s. Humankind is made of dependent beings, and we need care when we are vulnerable, and now we are over vulnerable. To deal with the vital conditions collectively, we need to build the concrete bridges, or like Jean Houry like to say in relation with the Clinique Laborde, so Silvia and Graeme will speak a lot of about Jean Houry, we must become pontonniers. So in pontonnier is like a constructor of bridges, like in Venice, the little bridges. So maybe with these constructions on bridges, we can also go out of control. Working time can stop being the dominant social time. Quoting André Gorz in Bantigny text, it implies to refuse to submit our lives to the imperative of the profitability of capital and competitiveness. That allows me to try to find a new strategy in this moment for academic work, now and in the future, when we will build a new curriculum, an ecological one, where care matters. If we think in terms of stopping production, academic capitalism production must be rethink. We will need long time and put aside the dynamics of the immediacy. That's why in this moment, I better keep listening to you. Bentigni article was published in a communist magazine called Contre-temps, Revue des critiques communistes. Setback, contre-temps, counter-terms. Yes, now we live a setback, but politically we must keep a lot of thoughts we are defending since long time ago. It's important to consider the wave of social movement as a procedural question, as Yves Cohen says in his article. I found this very, very interesting. Not to lose the control of the historical and political time. In this sense, we are still living in the same time as we were before March. Temps perdu, temps retrouvé, lost times, recovered times, because all the struggles lives in the involuntary memory, mémoire involontaire, of our body, lives in our bodies. It is true that we risk easily finding ourselves in a perpetual state of emergency, in perpetual state of control. And this is an exceptional situation. But besides biopolitical questions, it is besides the problem, the big problem of the control. It is very, very important not to forget that the left must organize their political radicalism around strong social bases and thinking about material conditions that sustain our lives. Today is 25 April. Parabéns portugueses, auguri Italians, la resistenza continua.
I think Silvia Maglioni and Graeme Thomson want to introduce their presence. Yes, are filmmakers and artists based in Paris, and their practice interrogates potential forms and fictions emerging from the ruins of moving image and includes the creation of short and films. They will introduce remaking sort of a science fiction scenario of Félix Guattari, Un amour d'Huic, A Love of Huic. The Guattari's film was written in collaboration with Robert Hammer and was never realized. It tells the story of the encounter between a group of squatters and Huic, the universe infraquark, an infracellular alien intelligence, coming from the infinitely small, capable of propagating itself through viral contagion. So I give the image and the word to Silvia Maglioni and Graeme Thomson. Please.
Hello, can everybody hear us?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Hello.
We're sorry we don't have video, but our internet connection was too unstable for us to keep the video link. So thanks very much for inviting us to speak here. Hello, Aurora. Nice to see you. Well, in a way, this film of Félix Guattari, for us, maybe in this context, considering the urgency of the situation is kind of a pretext, in a way, to speak about the relationship between Guattari's idea and the concept of virality and mutation. Because what's interesting now for us, looking back at this project, which is a project that we more or less finished 2 or 3 years ago, is in a sense the prescience and the prophetic quality of Guattari's vision of science fiction, a kind of speculative science fiction, but which was also very, very, in a sense, invested in the social and political mutations of, in this case, the 1980s. And perhaps this question of mutation is a really interesting way to think about the virus, both the virus in Guattari's terms and also in terms of the coronavirus. Because it's also about mutations of subjectivity, and in a sense the question of the mutation that takes place across different scales and different fields, a kind of heterogeneous field of things ranging from the somatic to the semiotic to the technological, both organic, inorganic. This is what happens in Guattari's film, that the character we, which is this kind of micro-physical, invisible entity which penetrates systems, both organic and inorganic, both bodies, systems of communication, weather systems, whatever you want. It kind of basically is omnipresent. And it was interesting to think that the virus, I mean, I think that what we should maybe think about is not to think about this as a kind of break or rupture or, you know, like the BC before coronavirus, after coronavirus way that we've become accustomed to thinking about this through particularly the mainstream media, the way it's been presented, but more as a continuum, as part of a continuum that has been, in a sense, that goes back much further. And a mutation, we could say a mutation in capital, of which it is part. The virus is part of a mutation in capital. It's related to the question of capital's penetration into the bios, into areas, for example, of food production, food colonization, as is very, very admirably detailed in Rob Cohen's book, Big Farms, Big Flu. And Rob Cohen, there was an article on that, which was relayed through Lundi Matin quite recently. And it's a very eye-opening perspective on the virus. But of course, here we're like talking a little bit, I mean, I think the theme today is more about the question of the authoritarian derives that have been occasioned by the virus. But I think that if we think about the question of mutations of subjectivities, we can say that some of the measures which in a sense have been introduced are really in a sense the extensions or the exacerbations of elements of a mutation in subjectivity which maybe have to do with what we could call the neoliberal subject. If we take, for example, the question of social distancing in its political reading is very much linked to the question of urban transformation, gentrification, the isolation of different social groups from each other. If we talk about self-isolation, we could say that the relationship that we have developed through viral and social media, more particularly social media, with technology is, in a sense, in as much as it creates a kind of hyper-connectivity, it also creates a kind of self-isolation in the rapport that is mediated through technology, which is a very, very, let's say, significant mutation in the way in which we mediate our relations are mediated through technology. So we could say that the virus has multi-dimensions, it's multi-dimensional. It has this kind of biosomatic dimension, but it also relates to these other dimensions. And what we could say is that the consequences of the coronavirus are very much, in a sense, the question which is raised is how these forms of practice, of existence, which already exist, how they will mutate. Now, we've heard a lot of interesting talk about the way in which, for example, self-isolation is now producing kind of a return to a kind of, let's say, an augmentation of affectivity. So this could be, in a sense, a moment in which a certain unconscious mutations of subjectivity which produce self-isolation can, in a sense, reach a kind of consciousness which then re-injects a kind of political affectivity into those modalities. And this, I think, is perhaps one of the more positive possible, let's say, exits from the virus, that we renegotiate our relationship with technology and introduce this affective supplement which can undo some of its more toxic effects. But then to think about, I think, Agamben, and I think that what's interesting about Agamben's text, because he's been writing quite a lot and continuously, like a kind of diary, is the extent to which we were prepared beforehand for all of these measures. The way in what's surprising is the immediate effectiveness of lockdown, how, in a sense, complicit we were right from the beginning with the idea, and that such that it didn't take a major shift. And here I'm talking specifically about Europe and America and what we could call first world, or in a sense, the kind of neoliberal economies. The way in which this mutation in subjectivity, which in a sense was already in place, made it fairly easy for these measures to be introduced and to be effective. And how is it that, in a sense, we, what I think is interesting, it's not about the question of lockdown or social distancing or not, it's more about the question of whether or not we are able to negotiate the terms of our own, let's say, responsibility to each other, or whether these terms are imposed by some kind of centralizing power. And the other question that I would say is quite interesting regarding the question of the resurfacing of the leader, the authoritarian leader, and particularly with regard to the question of those invisible movements and social movements, or at least faceless or leaderless social movements, is that I think that this virus, precisely because of its invisibility, because of its omnipresence, because of its radical indeterminacy in terms of how we even feel that we are close to it or far away from it, whether we're safe, whether we're not safe, is producing a kind of reinvestment in the facialization of power, whatever it is, whether it's competent or incompetent. I think that the question of the faces of people like Boris Johnson, whatever face it happens to be, Macron, there is a kind of sense in which this facialization, which was a very, very crucial theme both of Deleuze and Guattari in terms of their analysis of power, is resurfacing in a way that is quite worrying, to the extent to which just simply having faces to communicate orders is, in a sense, functioning to some extent. There are obviously resistances, and the resistances are linked to people who are, in a sense, at the social margin, often at the social margins of these kind of behaviors and these behavioral complexes. We've seen there have been riots in the banlieue in France. We've seen the way in which healthcare workers, particularly from Black and let's say, BAME groups in Britain, have been very, very active in a sense, refusing the blandishments of central government. But in general, we could say that there is also a very, very kind of this reassuring idea that power has a face, and that this face is a kind of counterposed to the invisibility of the virus itself. if Silvia really want to add something.
Well, Graeme said more or less everything we had to say. So I don't know if somebody had the time to watch the film that was in the link, I believe, that Francesca sent around. So we are really open to questions, maybe later, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have on what it is film and the rapport with the virus.
Maia, do you want to react?
So, hi Francesca, and thanks for inviting me to the present discussion. And firstly, from the beginning, I was wondering what my contribution could have been as an architect and a theorist. Architecture is par excellence a field of modification. It's putting into shape a desire for change. And in this sense, the perspective of change is an ontological and operational dimensions for us architects, and the desire to. And this view intertwines with that of past and recent theoretical insight and critical insight, in which, as example, the theme of utopia was part of my doctoral thesis in architectural design, the drawing of urban utopia. So I tried initially as a joke to reconsider the present scenario, which has so deeply modified our starting reality from the point of view of the typical modalities of utopian narration: the journey, the promise, the new world, the mandatory conditions necessary for the realization of the project proposed as possible. As I proceeded in this direction, it became more and more evident to me how the current pandemic scenario of the COVID-19 actually configures a real counter-utopia. A typical procedure of utopian narrative is that of inversion, the distance from everyday reality, overturning it, that is the necessary condition for the utopian journey to begin, its new and different spatial and temporal dislocation, on the other side, above, below, however, beyond any possible horizon already experienced or lived. There is now, in the new scenario opened by the planetary emergency COVID-19, an opposite condition, that of a journey backwards, where the condition of the new journey implies the return to home, the permanence, and the starting reality becomes a mirage, and not rather what we normally flee or move from. Taking distance from previous habits become an obligatory condition and not a free choice. The non-place, utopos, or the other place where to take refuge, takes on the appearance of one's own home, an affective and domestic place par excellence, habitus which suddenly becomes prison, place of own imprisonment and exclusions of the others. Habitus, from the Latin habito, connected to habeo, to have, sums up well the breadth of this new domestic border, where living means to have certain habits, wearing certain clothes, and our home corresponds to our external perimeter. The archetype of the primitive hut, the first act of the architecture in living, home, shelter, refuge, becomes the new place of confinement and deprivation of individual freedoms. Stay home as a sentence. This ongoing counter-utopia nevertheless takes on the progressive character of the utopia. Everything will be fine. so reassured by the rainbows that preview scenarios of a colorful optimism. We live a parallel life in which, having completed transferred at distance our experience of places, our contacts, our life and affectivity, we renounce to any guarantee of protection and abdicate without more reservation to each, even if minimal, residual right in terms of privacy. This progressive renunciation, this irreversible and unstoppable dispossession actually creates the condition of a further dystopian rift. The technological one, a digital hypertrophy in which, in order to continue to exist in confinement, we become passive tools of the technological medium and totally subordinate to the game rules that others have established for us. Even if this process was already fully underway, the new coronavirus emergency makes us now inevitably more feeble and totally passive consumers of technology, to which we do not offer any further resistance. If the new health mapping procedures will apply and extend, as they've already been extensively used in China and South Korea and Singapore, we shall all live happy and mapped, being reassured that everything will be fine. When? How long? While the option is still under discussion in Italy, and given the given name of the app immune, obeys a logic of conviction. This dystopian scenario rises under the conviction that the total transfer of our freedom will be rewarded. We'll no longer have to worry about. Others will establish and move from time to time the boundary between individual freedom and collective rights. As in the utopian story, the narrative used the form of an indirect story. The invisible virus becomes an instrument of a similar narration, although overturned. The horizon towards which to aim is that of its disappearance, and not rather that of its affirmation. An ideal already partially achieved in a distant elsewhere, the effectiveness of the method of containment of the pandemia in China and South Korea. This definitely legitimizes an measure of contraction of individual freedoms in the name of the higher collective interest, and then position of an overturned journey home to take distance radically from the surrounding existing reality. Thus, as it happens in any self-respecting utopian or dystopian narrative, the observance of many strict prescriptions and new superior orders becomes necessary. Appropriate behaviors, social distances, how to dress, what to eat, and medicalness explained. Nothing is left to chance to ensure the effectiveness of the project proposed as possible. The history of urban utopia and counter-utopia is full of similar examples. The totalitarian drift, disguised as an anti-COVID care, is already the present scenario. As in fact, some authoritative observers in Italy are pointing out, from exception to exception, the desertification of democracy and the implementation of a neo-authoritarian regime foreshadowed with the formal notice of Parliament and the urgent decree of the Prime Minister. We are witnessing a progressive request for centralization and nationalization. And while on the one hand, all this inevitably happens, on the other, no reward looms on the horizon, a necessary condition in the utopian narrative, nor a radical change in the policy of management of natural, human, economic resources, a new gaze which overturns the policies of maximum performance and exploitation to lead us to a new real humanism, a different and more sustainable coexistence. Perhaps this is precisely what makes the post-pandemic scenario even more frightening. The best horizon proposed is that everything will be fine, which means to contain in the immediate, defeating in the future the virus, and implicitly represents the return to the status quo. In this scenario of the COVID-19 counter-utopia, the best of all possible worlds sadly remains the current, or should I actually say, due to the radical change.
In the meanwhile, Luca Cinquemani has sent us the materials, the things that, the action that he just did today with his collective. I will let Luca explain us what he did. Okay, Luca, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Yes. What did you send us?
Yes, I sent us some collective intervention we did despite the lockdown, because I think the contradiction Joan underlined is very important. It's very paradoxical how we can create a community if we are totally separated. I think it's very utopian to think it's possible, which first we should interrogate ourselves about which kind of community we can create with this extremization of digital connection, this hyper connection and hyper separation at the same time. And because we quoted before Agamben, I would come back to the idea of what is an apparatus. It's very difficult to think it's possible to use the digital technologies in a way we want. I think it's too much maybe optimistic. So I'm very convinced it's important to find some some spaces to retake the possibility of the proximity of the bodies. Today is the 25 April in Italy, is the day of the celebration of the liberation from the Nazi fascists. So we wanted, respecting the distances in a way, to sign some fascist architecture inside the city of Palermo with this red fabric, red tissue. In this case, the picture we are seeing now is the Central Post building, very big from fascist area. The idea was to give the possibility to everybody to do it not only in the fascist architecture or fascist onomastic celebration of the street, but also to sign with a red object all the fascism we can see also in our relationship, in work relationship, private relationship. There is also the microfascism. So it was a collective intervention, but in particular we organized one intervention in which everybody had the possibility to come back to the street, of course with the distance, and this is the result today. Has been a way to try gradually to come back to the street, to come back to re-experiment the possibility to stay together in a special way of proximity of bodies, despite the lockdown, despite so it's very difficult, I know, but I don't think we can continue to imagine a creation of a collectivity without to stay together. It's very important. We have no other possibility in this moment. but I think we can't force too much the medium, because the medium is a frame, very rigid in a way. So it's very important to create the ground, but we have to come back together. We have to come back inside the city. This is the fight. This is the ground of the fight. We have to come back, and so we have to be prepared in a way. We have to think to come back to take this kind of revolutionary strength, which only can born where bodies are in proximity.
And Max Goetz wants to say something. He's studying political science at Free University in Berlin.
Yes, thank you. I'd also like to talk about the controversies, and I would raise the question whether it is really connected to the virus itself, the tendency from autocrats to use this crisis. I think is not a real surprise, but it's normal that every autocrat is always using every crisis to dismantle the democratic institutions he's trying to turn over. So I think this tendency is seen in the last 70 years of all different kinds of populists or autocrats, that they're always trying to use crises. And we shouldn't be that scared about this, not more than the tendencies in all other autocrat situations ever. So for example, in the United States, I think we have a resilience of the democratic, or not we, but you have a resilience of the democratic institutions, which is not so easy to overturn. There are many security measures who keep staying in place, although the crisis is hitting hard. But the thing I'd rather problematize is the rally around the flag effect we have in many different countries, which is also not really connected to the virus, but you can see it in all crisis situations, that the people are kind of sticking to the devil they know. It's normal that criticism on the government is less in situations of crisis. So I think also here, it's not the real issue that the coronavirus is hitting, but that something is hitting the countries. And therefore, I think we should focus on the real problems and on the first controversy, which was risen, that we have this new corona issues, and to problematize that these crisis-driven issues on democracy are always the same, and we should problematize them as they are, like the problems we know, and we know how to fight them. For example, the EU has measures to fight the authoritarianism of Poland and of Hungary, but they're not doing it because of other issues, as we know. For example, the Hungarian way to close borders is in the interest of the European Union. So I think we should focus on that, not blame the virus for everything that happens in our democracies. Thank you.
Initially, my thought was to think about the authoritarian turn. But actually, after hearing you all, I think the main issue is rather the creativity. We are actors of this creativity. So maybe the question would rather be the organization of our creativity, and also the organization of new assets of power. Maybe we should think better. We should acknowledge the work we are doing to rethink this post-COVID world everyone is talking about. The post-COVID is right now. We are already in the future of our present, so in a way. So we are kind of actualizing not only dystopias, but we are actualizing utopias, democratic utopias for the future, but in our present. So the question is, how are we organizing this? So how are we organizing this means also what kind of political model do we want to envision for our actual start?
I just want to thank you for opening the discussion. I think you've ended in exactly the right note. We have these big questions we have to think about, and you've enabled us to be able to do that. So I want to thank you very much for that, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
I'm so grateful of all the incredible insights and you gave us. And I will say, see you soon to our next meeting. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you and goodbye, and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.